warm summer evening back in 1907 when Alfred von Berger went into his garden in Vienna's certain district to perform an experiment. Although the area he lived in was considered a quiet neighborhood, he started to make a note of all the various sounds that reached his ears. And then, just like so many other armchair scientists at the turn of the century, he proceeded to categorize these sounds. Here's what he heard. First, the big city noises, mechanical and loud. Then the sounds of people going about their business or leisure. Finally, the urban adapted flora and fauna made its way into the soundscape. Von Berger was part of a growing group of people who pleaded for a right to silence. They called themselves the anti-noise movement, and being level-headed, sensible people who had noticed the rising levels of background noise in cities, they concluded that it must be, at least partially, responsible for a series of nervous and physical ailments that affected the health and well-being of residents. In short, it was high time someone would confront this urban cacophony, and by Jove, were the middle classes up for it. And all were happy upon witnessing the results of such common sense measures, and it was good. Yeah, noise is bad, and they spanked it. The end. Thanks for watching and all that. Okay, chances are that if something involves people who proudly identify as middle class, it won't be a straightforward and non-problematic affair. Somewhere along the way, the working classes, or the variously shaded poor, if you prefer, are bound to get shafted, and we'll be looking at how it happened and how it probably still happens in a place near you. So join me in exploring the not-so-gentle noise suppression of the bourgeoisie. As early as 1901, American surgeon John H. Gardner had coined the term New Yorkitis to refer to a condition of mind, body, and soul that he had observed among patients living in the noisiest areas of the city. And it wasn't just that urban life was producing new sounds, typical of the industrial age, but also that the way built structures were made and arranged added to the problem. The residential buildings, factories, and municipal projects that had sprung up during the building frenzies of the 1850s and 70s often formed street canyons, which led to sound reflecting and rebounding off the stone walls. Furthermore, people were required to become increasingly mobile as their workplaces, homes, and places of fun were further and further apart. To address this, the public transit system grew rapidly. However, so did the surfaces dedicated to cars, in what must have been an ingenious, century-long plot to really annoy at least one Hungarian YouTuber. In the 1900s, a city like Vienna, for instance, was awash with the sound of hired carriages, streetcars, and trains. Increasingly, human and animal sounds were overtaken by motorized vehicles and other mechanical noises. In addition, the fact that the type and intensity of the signals used to ward off dangers also grew in harshness points to the need to penetrate a much denser web of noise than in previous centuries. For instance, ambulances, firefighters, and the police had replaced trumpet signals and bells with wailing sirens. Urban activities advanced further and further into the night thanks to street lighting. Streetcars ran until 10 p.m. and the late hours of the evening and early hours of the morning were used for maintenance and repair work. With so many disturbing noise sources, where does one even begin? Well, here are a few things to consider. While we do have units of measurement for the intensity of sounds and also studies showing the impact of certain loud environments on people living or working nearby, we certainly don't judge noises just based off of their intensity or the time of the day that they intrude upon us. We also accept, or at least tolerate, certain noises if we or our community can find some social utility in the final result. For instance, repairing a road or the landscaping of a park. More often than not, however, a neighborhood's right to a non-polluted soundscape is linked to how much of a fuss they can kick up and continue kicking up sustainably over an extended period of time. But to understand how definitions are constructed, we need to take a look at the people writing them. Who were the guys and gals introducing the idea of noise abatement into the public discourse at the turn of the 20th century? It was the bourgeoisie. In Germany, the movement was led by philosopher and psychologist Theodor Lessing, who wanted to create a coalition of intellectuals which would propose and lobby for noise abatement reforms and ordinances. In the US, the founders of the anti-noise movement were also violently middle class. Julia Barnett Rice had a medical degree and Isaac Rice was a venture capitalist. In Austria, it was von Berger, a theatre director, and Eduard Hanslick, a music critic, that were among the promoters of the cause. Finally, Dr. Thomas Jeeves Horder, who was a lord, of course, was deeply involved with Britain's Anti-Noise League. For much of its history, noise abatement efforts have been a distinctly bougie endeavor, which means that their efforts were shaped by the group's own particular interests and ideas about what constituted an ideal working and living environment within a city. Noise thus was presented as being damaging to the capacity of the highly skilled professional middle-class man exercising his superior intellect, or as the cause of neurasthenia, an antiquated psychiatric concept that was used at the time to describe an illness affecting the nerves of the cultivated classes. To be fair, some of the measures that these activist groups pushed for, once implemented, ended up improving people's lives, especially in big cities, but the temptation for it to devolve into policing working-class people's behavior in public and private spaces was really strong. And, as a wise man once said, the only way to get rid of temptation is to yield to it. And boy, did they yield to it! In Austria, some of the most zealous anti-noise activists compiled listicles of blue and blacklisted establishments based on their noisiness. Eduard Hanslick, the music critic of the Neue Freie Presse, complained about the daily pains we suffer from the hands of amateurish neighbors tinkling or pupils exercising. I honestly believe that this musical torture is the most wearing of all discordant sounds and noises which torment the ears and dull the senses of city people every day. Across European cities, the practice of cracking whips, ringing bells, and sounding horns was restricted or prohibited. Carts without springs were only allowed to go at walking speed, and rubber became very sexy. Gramophones, noisy teenagers, orchestra music from the cinema, shutters opening and closing were also put on the naughty list. In fact, British architectural theorist Hope Bagnall, and I also hope that's how that name is pronounced, was deeply concerned about the menace of the loudspeaker. So much so that he suggested that flats inhabited by working-class people, who were too dumb to appreciate the virtues of quietness in his opinion, should have their gramophones or radio sets controlled by a building attendant who would manage the volumes and the times at which users could listen in. Noise reduction also meant shutting up scores of street musicians, knife grinders, yelling junkmen, hucksters, peddlers, thus endangering their means to earn a living. Back in the US, when the police threatened to ban megaphones on Coney Island in 1907, the Barkers Union staged a protest. The newspapers of the time reported one of the Barkers declaring that "How are you going to get a crowd to come and see the boy with a tomato head and the rest of the wonders if you don't talk to them?" Other dramas unfolded as advertising by way of shouting became a no-no. How shall the scissor grinder tell the cliff dweller that he is below and willing to make knives and scissors as sharp as razors? And then, of course, the next step was conspiracies. The whole thing is a move to add power to the janitor. They will say that all the tenants who want butcher knives or scissors ground must tell the janitor in advance, and then we may go in and ask the janitor about it. Won't the janitor come in on the graft? We will have to make ourselves solid with the janitor or we won't get anything. I see it all. It's a plot of theirs. And think of the time lost asking each one of them. Is this a free country? I ask it. It is not. And as it so often happens after a while, the rest of the non-bougie segment of the public began to fight back against some of these measures and even against the framing of the issues of noise in cities. Which leads us to Part 2. Noise is just a state of mind. While members of Britain's Anti-Noise League argued that our senses are essential to our sense, in an effort to conserve the middle-class home as a place where pipe-smoking gentlemen would be quietly reading books while neglecting their wives and children, industrialists flipped on their
"this woke shit has gone too far"
switch.
Actually, our workers love their noisy workplaces. In fact, they think the factory floor is too quiet, you see.
The UK's Industrial Health Research Board dismissed any arguments about the link between noise and neurasthenia, arguing instead that noise sensitivity was not a physical cause of mental illness, but a symptom of it, essentially calling the activist hysterical snowflakey libs because
eardrums? Fuck eardrums. Real men don't need eardrums protected.
Furthermore, the board went on and recommended that the workers tune in to the BBC's Listen While You Work, a broadcast designed to alleviate boredom. Truth be told, despite the fact that on the shop floor people were exposed to an enormous level of sound pollution, noise abatement activists had little support among working class people. Shocker, I know. You'd think they appreciate the pestering. And also, the daily exposure to high levels of noise in factories also meant that workers were more tolerant of the varied noises that disturb the more delicate ears of the middle classes, whose lists of annoyances seemed to grow by the day. But here's the thing, the reluctance to support or straight-out opposition to noise reduction policies had little to do with the workers being loud ogres who had no need for peace and quiet to enjoy more lofty pursuits. The shouty man or woman advertising their wares or services on the streets did it because it worked. Advertising in the newspaper or handing out leaflets was a luxury many couldn't afford. After all, shop owners, barbers, or confectionaries made use of the available media of the day to let the public know about their business, so it was clearly a question of money. And this is something that is still glossed over today when we talk about seemingly irrational opposition of working class people to what looks like sensible measures. Working class people who oppose things that seem to be self-evidently good for their community don't do that because they wouldn't enjoy less noisy, less polluted or congested cities. I mean, you could argue that some individuals are just incorrigible assholes, regardless of class, but in many such instances, it's more likely the case that people don't want to see their way of earning a living disrupted without there being an equally viable alternative in sight. After all, Maslow was quite right about placing food, shelter, and the need for a sense of safety and security at the base of his pyramid of needs. Now, in case you're one of those pathologically positive people, you might think that all this class bullying from the bourgeoisie is a thing of the past, or that somehow we're all middle class now, or classless, and there's no one left to bully, really. Yeah, no. You see, one of the lasting accomplishments of organizations such as the Society for the Suppression of Unnecessary Noise in the US was the introduction of the idea of quiet zones. Initially, these were supposed to be set up around hospitals and schools to help the young and infirm. Over time, however, these innocuously sounding places have been tools in the hands of the more whip-cracking kind of local authorities. For instance, under the mayorship of Michael Bloomberg, several popular gathering spots for street performers, among them Bethesda Fountain in Central Park, were declared quiet zones. Summonses for singing and playing instruments were emitted by the truckload, although public outcry eventually led to the fines being dismissed. In 2006, pressured by local businesses, Chicago City Council voted to ban public performers from 4 of the most congested blocks on the Magnificent Mile. 11 years later, the same city council was looking to extend the ban further on sections of Michigan Avenue and State Street. According to officials, the measures were prompted by complaints coming from office workers in those areas, annoyed at having to listen to music throughout their workday. The performers protested the decision, saying that Michigan and State is our bread and butter. That's where the bulk of the tourists are. We rely mostly on tourists. As someone who enjoys a relatively quiet work environment, I understand that having the same songs on a loop throughout the day, several days a week, can become annoying. Although, soundproof windows do exist. Of course, they might require some investment on the part of management or the property's landlord, and some sort of, compromise to be had, and, well, we can't have that. Here, just as in the case of the peddlers and various servicemen and women at the turn of the 20th century, there is a fundamental imbalance of power between groups that authorities are inclined to listen to, businesses and office workers who, albeit have a case for a less noisy environment, come up against various street performers or vendors who are fighting to hang on to a vital source of their livelihoods without being offered alternatives.
Oh, but why should authorities even try to find solutions for the people they are displacing? It's up to them to hustle and make do.
And to that I say, what happened to protecting job creators? Because pardon me for being a dreamer, but if governments across Europe and the US thought that it was paramount to salvage a truckload of business behemoths despite them, being Nazi collaborators and war profiteers because, won't someone think of the jobs involved, then maybe, just maybe, they could extend an ounce of that magnanimity to the peasant classes fighting for their livelihoods on the streets as well. Say what you want about street performers, but I still think even the most tone deaf of them is better than the guys making deals with Goering. Finally, our journey covering the fascinating world of noise suppression as viewed through the eyes of the bourgeoisie brings us back full circle to more noise. But this is righteous noise, meant to fight the bad noise. You need a good guy producing noise to stop a bad guy from producing noise. Because it's a truth universally acknowledged that teenagers are annoying and gross and nobody wants to be near them, some of the shops that these vile creatures use as gathering spots have started blaring loud classical music through speakers outside their premises. Yes, these teenage fools have the audacity to think that they have a right to any sort of public space. Like, honestly, what are streets for? Oh. Yet somehow it gets even more petty. The mosquito, an ultrasonic noise device that emits an extremely annoying tone that, due to the degradation of human hearing, is only audible to people under the age of 25, is among the most popular anti-loitering devices in use in the United States. Here's what one happy customer had to say about it.
The mosquito worked perfectly last night. I got it hooked up just in time for the kids to show up and make a lot of noise. After I turned it on, they began complaining and left shortly thereafter. This thing is amazing!
Now, before we wrap this up, I'd just like to add that, yes, noise reduction is, as a general principle, something to strive for. Increased noise levels can negatively affect our health, mood, and disrupt our sleep. As anyone living in a badly insulated comic block can testify, noise is only acceptable when you're the one generating it, while doing something fun, alone, or with one or several consenting adults. It's not cringe to want to limit noise levels just because the middle class is mad crazy about it and has always had strong opinions on the matter and, also strong public involvement. The point of this little thing right here was to show that questions around what counts as noise and who is allowed to produce it and why are often answered with an eye on people's income brackets or zip codes. If you're in the right one, you might be able to join the conversation and even drive the agenda. If not, chances are you're not even aware someone is having it, except you do now. So... Thank you for watching, and also thank you to all the new people viewing and commenting on the channel. Yes, even you guys who disagree with what's being said, but it's all good. And of course, happy and grateful noises to the people that have been boosting my previous video essay. Thanks! As usual, share, like and subscribe, and, you know, if you're feeling chatty, leave a comment. I hear it's the popular thing to do, or something. Okay, bye 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 bye!